Good afternoon, everyone, or perhaps good morning. I don't know what time you are actually watching me give this talk. My name is David Cruz-Uribe, and I will be the speaker today. I'm a parishioner at the University at St. Francis Parish and a faculty member at the University of Alabama. And I will be speaking as part of the Martin de Porres Project lecture series. And the title of my talk is Seeing Racism, Providing Context and Introduction to the Martin de Porres Project lecture series. So let me begin by introducing you to the Martin de Porres Project, which was founded here at St. Francis Parish with the three-part goal of helping Catholics see racism, working to build racial justice in our church and in our nation, and promoting healing through racial harmony. Now, I want to emphasize as we go into this talk that each step, each goal rests strongly on the previous one. If we're going to have healing through racial harmony, then we have to first build racial justice. As Pope Paul VI put it, if you want peace, work for justice. And in order to build racial justice, we have to identify racial injustice, which means that we have to be able to see and critique racism in America. Now, talking about racism is always difficult, and I know going into this talk that it's going to make a lot of you more than a little uncomfortable in parts. And I really wish that I could be there to engage with you in a dialogue about these topics, but I can't. It's the nature of a pandemic that this talk is being delivered electronically. But if you have questions or concerns, I'll have some contact information at the end, and I hope you will reach out to me because I really want to talk about these issues with other people. Okay, this is the first in a 5-part lecture series built roughly around the 3 goals of the Martin de Porres Project. So today I'll be introducing, and my entire talk is about seeing racism. And this provides context and an introduction for the second 2 parts of our talk. In part 2, Father Tom will give an overview of Open Wide Our Hearts, a pastoral letter from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, which talks about racism in our church and in America. And then in the 3rd part, Joe Van Heest will give 2 lectures on the new encyclical by Pope Francis, Fratelli Tutti, Brothers and Sisters to All, which is about the Pope's vision for building a world in which harmony, racial harmony, bridging the gap across all the divisions that inflict us is possible. All right, so I guess the natural question is, why are we having this conversation? And the first answer, which I'm sure comes to a lot of your minds, is George Floyd, who was murdered last May by a Minneapolis police officer under tragic circumstances. And this led to widespread demonstrations and some violence across the United States as huge crowds, Black and white, protested his death. Many of you will associate these protests with the Black Lives Matter movement. Martin de Porres Project responded to this, or rather wanted to respond to this. The pandemic clearly slowed us down. But like the Black Lives Matter movement, the Martin de Porres Project predates the murder of George Floyd. And the reason is his death is just one in a long line of tragic deaths stretching back decades. And just to see this, let's say their names and see how many of these names you recognize. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Stephen Clark, Philando Castile, Alton Sterling, Walter Lamar Scott, Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Trayvon Martin. What do all of these people have in common? They're Black, and each one died at the hands of the police or of vigilantes acting in a police-like fashion. A list of a dozen people going back only 8 years. And this is not everyone I could have listed. And I could have continued the list stretching back decades, ultimately merging into the list of Blacks and Latinos lynched in America. And if you want to see a list of those, I recommend a trip to the lynching memorial in Montgomery, recording the names of the thousands of people lynched in the United States in the past century. Okay. We say their names because this identifies part of the problem. People being killed by the police, seemingly because they're Black. Now, each of them is an individual story. Each of them is a complicated story, but they're part of a pattern of racial oppression, of racial discrimination, of racial injustice in America. And that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about seeing this racism in America. But before we can see it, before we can talk about racism, we have to talk about race. After all, the two are pretty obviously linked, but let's step back for a moment and say, what is race? How do we know it? I mean, well, you'll probably respond, well, it's obvious. White, Black, Asian, Latino, Native American, maybe Pacific Islander. It all does seem kind of commonsensical and obvious, right? Well, I want to suggest that race isn't as obvious or commonsensical as we think it is, and that there are parts of it that should make us step back and question the whole concept of race and all the meanings that we assign to it. So let me give you two examples. First, this is a picture of Gregory Howard Williams and an unidentified friend of his. Gregory Williams is an academic. He was formerly the president of the University of Cincinnati and then of the City College of New York, born and raised in Muncie, Indiana. Well, not born, but definitely raised there. And you're thinking, okay, and Gregory Howard Williams is a Black man. Okay. He's the one on the right in this picture. The gentleman on the left is his unidentified friend, a picture taken during his high school years in Muncie, Indiana. Wait, you're all saying, no. The guy on the left is Black, the guy on the right is white. It's obvious. But nevertheless, the person on the right, Gregory Williams, is Black. And let me tell you the story of how this came to pass. His father was a light-skinned Black man and living in 1940s Virginia, chose for a lot of reasons to describe himself as Italian so that he could pass as white in white society. He ended up marrying a white woman. They had two kids, Gregory Williams and his brother. Unfortunately, his father was an alcoholic, his business failed, his marriage broke up, and his wife divorced him and left him with the children. So, alone with two small kids, broke, Gregory Williams' father didn't know what to do, so he decided to move home to be with his mother in his hometown of Muncie, Indiana. And on the bus ride back to Indiana, he explained to his son, particularly Gregory, the older one, that he was Black. Never mind that the first 10 years of his life, he had grown up thinking, acting, and believing that he was white. When they moved to Muncie, Indiana, and settled in the Black neighborhood where his mother lived, he was immediately Black. He went to a segregated Black elementary school. He went to an integrated high school, but throughout his high school years, identified with and was identified as a Black student at that high school. The people of Muncie, Indiana saw him, irrespective of what he looks like in this picture, as Black. Here's another more recent example. This is a Facebook friend of mine. His name is Father Stefanos Pedrano. He's a Benedictine monk. And you might run into him on social media because he is the official social media representative of his monastery. And so spends a lot of time on Facebook and other places. Okay. Now, you look at him and you go, Okay, he looks like a black man. As a matter of fact, he looks to me a little bit like Colin Powell, but he's not black. He says he's Filipino, Chinese, and Spanish by heritage, but in America, he is routinely identified as and treated as a black man. So let's step back here and ask, well then, how does race work? If this person, Gregory Howard Williams, who to us obviously looks white, could be identified and spend his high school years as black, and indeed to this day, he still identifies himself as black. He will not break faith with the people who sustained him and supported him during those years. Or Father Pedrano, who is not black, but must accept that white society identifies him as black. So what exactly does race mean? We'll come back to this. But having challenged or shaken up your thinking on race just a little bit, I want to turn now to racism and ask the question, what is racism? And I'm going to split racism up into two pieces, okay? The first is what I'm going to call personal racism, and is what I assume you and most people would identify as racism. But there's another piece to it, which I'm going to call structural racism. Some people call it institutional racism. And I'm going to claim that that's a bigger thing and a more important thing. It's harder to see. It's not obvious, but it's there, it's pervasive, and it defines what is personal racism in America. Okay, but let's start with personal racism. We've all encountered it. Okay, think through your life and you will have maybe an uncle with his tasteless jokes or his comments about black athletes. Or maybe it's a coworker who casually drops the N-word into conversation. Or maybe it's the person you've run into in person or on social media who starts out by saying, I'm not racist, but, and then proceeds to say something that you go, wow, that's really kind of racist. Okay, so personal racism is out there. What is it? Mark cites Bishop of El Paso in a letter to his diocese that he wrote after the massacre in El Paso of Latinos in the Walmart by a gunman, wrote the following: this mystery of evil also includes the base belief that some of us are more important, deserving, and worthy than others. It includes the ugly conviction that this country belongs more properly to white people than to people of color. This is a perverse way of thinking that divides people based on heritage and tone of skin into us and them, worthy and unworthy. And I think what's really important about this is identifying it in these terms as worthy and unworthy, us and them, and grounding it in the mystery of evil, the mystery of sin in the human condition. So that's personal racism. We've all run into it in one shape or the other, but I'm sure that most of you would deny being personally racist, and I think that's right. You probably aren't, okay? And that's why structural racism is much more important a concept. It's harder to see, but I want you to make the effort with me, okay? The whole idea of structural racism comes out of a theological notion that Pope John Paul II referred to as structures of sin. The fact that personal sin isn't simply an act, but it can have a lasting effect. It shapes our relationships with other people. It shapes the way our communities form and exist, and it shapes our societies. Structural racism is what happens when the personal sin becomes part of our society. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, in their pastoral, Open Wider Hearts, described it this way. Racism can also be institutional when practices or traditions are upheld that treat certain groups of people unjustly. The cumulative effects of personal sins of racism have led to social structures of injustice and violence that make us all accomplices in racism. So you were probably rolling along with this quote, but when we get to the end, a sudden stop. We are all accomplices in racism. What do they mean by that? Hold that in the back of your mind. We're going to come back to that at the end of this talk. Right now, though, I want to try and unpack this notion of structural racism. Okay, so I want to give you a technical definition because the whole concept is subtle and it's complicated. It's also, I'm afraid, going to make some of you uncomfortable. Walk with me. Try and work through your discomfort, and I think where we're going to be on the other side is a lot better place. But what is structural racism? I'm going to walk through a technical definition by Father Brian Massingale, a leading theologian in the United States who studies race and racism. And this is what he said. This is long. I'm going to read the whole thing. I don't expect you to get it all, but let's step through it. Racism functions as an ethos, as a pervasive symbol system of meaning, identity, and significance, much more than as a set of discrete, consciously motivated acts. Racism, understood as a pervasive symbol system of meaning, gives us a framework for comprehending the significance of personal acts of racial animus. It is a system of meaning that rests upon the fears and anxieties of white Americans and is expressed in the cultural symbols, social order, a cultural phenomenon, a way of interpreting human color differences that pervades the collective convictions, conventions, and practices of American life. It significantly informs the identity of the dominant group. Okay, there's a lot there. For the next 20 minutes in this talk, I would like to walk through this definition. I'm going to pick out the highlights and try and break down these key ideas. And hopefully, by doing that, I'll give you the language and some of the ideas needed to see racism in America. Okay? So let's start with this. Structural racism provides a system of meaning, identity, and significance. Okay. Well, let me ask you, when we're talking about racism, we're talking about race. So why do we even see race? Why does skin tone matter? Why not having green eyes, or being left-handed, or being blonde? We don't generally assign meaning to those. But race itself is a system of identity. It has meaning, it has significance. Okay? It means something to say that a person is Black or Latino. It means more than just the color of their skin or their ethnic background. It supposedly tells us something about them. Race has significance. So let me try and give you an example of how race has significance and how we've used race to explain things. This is a picture from my youth. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, star of the Lakers, one of the great Black basketball players of the 60s and 70s. And when I was in high school, a common question you would hear asked was, and I'm sure you still hear this question, why are Blacks so good at basketball? And now I remember hearing this question discussed, and the answers generally revolved around something like this. Well, Blacks are natural athletes. They're built for the game. Some people would even go and say, it's genetic. Okay. So being black meant that these particular individuals were good basketball players. Well, what about good white basketball players? At the time, for example, Larry Bird. Well, Larry Bird, he became a good basketball player because he worked hard. Okay, so it was about him as an individual. It wasn't his whiteness that had anything to do with being a basketball player, but his personal traits as an individual. Whereas the explanation for blacks collectively was their blackness. Blacks were good basketball players because they were black. Race had significance. But to put this idea in context, let's go back in time. 20s, 30s, 40s, when there still was pro basketball, not as big as it is now. And in that period, many of the great basketball players were Jews. I don't want to go so far as to say that Jews dominated basketball, but there were a lot of good Jewish players. So this is a picture of Ossie Schechtman, who is Jewish and is recorded as having scored the first goal in the first game of what later became the NBA. Okay, so it was a well-identified fact that this little ethnic group was punching all out of proportion to its weight in pro basketball. And so the question was, why? Why are Jews so good at basketball, they asked one another. And the explanation, according to historians, is that people said, well, basketball is a game of skill and misdirection. And Jews are naturally smart. And they're also crafty and sly. And those are traits that make somebody naturally good at basketball. So again, notice, it's not that they worked hard. It's not that this was a game played in the urban neighborhoods where Jews were growing up at this time. No, it was because they had some trait intrinsic to them that made them good at basketball. Being Jewish had significance far beyond a religious or cultural identity. We laugh at this now. I remember a decade or so ago telling this story in a class I was teaching about racism at my old school, and one of my students, who was Jewish, just burst out laughing because he had grown up with the stereotype that Jews weren't athletes, that Jews were good at academic pursuits. But when we got to talking about it, he remembered stories about his uncles and great uncles who had grown up playing basketball and had been really good at it. Okay, so now we laugh at this. We do not ascribe to being Jewish any particular innate ability to play basketball. But somehow this notion that blacks are good at basketball because they're natural athletes still survives. And that raises the question, what other meanings do we ascribe to being black? Okay, let's move on through Father Massengel's definition, okay? He says that structural racism arises out of fears and anxieties expressed in the social order and public policies. In other words, white people are afraid of, or at least uncomfortable around, blacks and other minorities. And this discomfort then begins to express itself both in the way we organize society and in the laws and public policies we put into place to uphold our social order. Okay? So what does this mean about being afraid? Well, there's this discomfort of being in a place, for example, where there are too many black people, driving through a black neighborhood, going to a black restaurant or black club, attending a comedy show where most of the people present are black. White people are okay with black people being present in their spaces as long as they're in the minority and it looks primarily as though this is a white space. But in a black space or around black people, some white people start to get uncomfortable. And now this is a personal feeling, okay? And feelings are feelings, but fears and anxieties have come to be expressed in our social order, okay? And in the laws. Now, overtly racist laws are mostly gone, okay? But the way the laws are enforced still embodies these fears. And this leads to a phenomenon well known in the Black community called driving while Black. Every Black person I have ever talked to has a version of this story. Here I'm going to tell one from Bishop Edward Braxton, Bishop Emeritus of Belleville in Illinois. He tells the story, and he was already a bishop when this happened. So he was a middle-aged, well-to-do Black man. He says, "I was driving in my car in an apparently all-white neighborhood with 2 small chairs in the back seat and a table in the partially opened trunk tied with a rope. A police car with flashing lights pulled me over. The officer asked, 'Where are you going with that table and those chairs?' Before I could answer, he asked, 'Where did you get them?' Then he said, 'We had a call about a suspicious person driving through the area with possibly stolen furniture in his trunk.' I wondered what I was doing to make someone suspicious. Many years would pass before I would hear the expression, racial profiling. What happened there? Someone in this white neighborhood saw a middle-aged Black man driving along in a car with some used furniture in the back. And out of fear, and only explanation I can come up with, out of fear thought, oh my goodness, this could have been a thief. He could have been stealing from my neighbors. I have to call the police. A stereotype. Race had significance. Race had a significance that triggered real fear. Okay? And it's not just driving, it's other things. For example, a hooded sweatshirt, a hoodie. Okay? I'm sure many of you own them. I own them. We wear them. But what do you think when you see a young Black man wearing a hoodie? What are the images? What are the associations that leap into mind? For far too many people, thug is their response, which led to this picture being taken, because these are in fact Howard University medical students in 2013. And this picture was taken shortly after George Zimmerman was acquitted of the murder of Trayvon Howard. Part of the story of that night was George Zimmerman called the police to report a suspicious individual. Why did he look suspicious? He was wearing a hoodie. So the top photograph, young medical students wearing hoodies, young Black men and a few Black women. Are they suspicious? But then they put on the trademark of their profession. They put on the long white coat. What's changed? And I would say it's not just with Blacks, and it's not just with hoodies. For example, bandanas. Now, I was wearing this as I prepared the talk, so I have it sitting here. So now you see a Chicano with a bandana. I'm old, so I don't look this threatening. But I will tell you, when I wore this when I was young in graduate school, people would try and buy drugs from me. White strangers would come up to me on the streets and say, "Hey man, can I score?" And what do you see if you see a young Black man wearing a bandana? Or later in life, I acquired a beaded skull cap. And I wear this. It's a comfortable hat. Multiple times walking down the street wearing this hat, I have been accosted, threatened once, by people who see the hat. And what do they see? They see a Muslim. They see an other. They see a terrorist. They see someone who doesn't belong here. Okay? They're afraid, and they're expressing their fear violently. These are the fears and anxieties which shape race in America. And these are the fears and anxieties which have led to social and legal structures that oppress Black men and women in America. So what were these structures? Well, let's take a look. Originally, Before the founding of the United States, we had slavery, which was a legal and social system that reduced Blacks to property. And I want to stress that it wasn't simply a legal system. It was a social system, a series of beliefs that Blacks were not human, that Blacks deserved to be made into property. It was only because of those social beliefs that you would have a legal structure in which they could be reduced to property. The Civil War ended slavery, but it was quickly replaced with a new system called Jim Crow. And this was a legal and social system that relegated Blacks to a subservient second-class status. A system of segregation, a system of oppression, one backed by violence. Okay, but again, let me stress, it wasn't simply a legal system, it was a social system. It was a system of beliefs that shaped how people saw Blacks. They thought that the world was a better place as long as Blacks kept to their place. And it was the dominant white culture that defined for Blacks, and also in places like Texas and California for Mexican Americans, defined for them what their place in society was. The civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s broke the back of Jim Crow. It did not go away. Racist structures, both legal and social, persist. And I just want to focus on the law and the enforcement of the law. And I think Driving While Black illustrates that you don't have to have overtly racist laws for the law to be used in racist ways. And so what we have now is we have a legal and social system called the new Jim Crow, okay? Because it's a social system that targets, prosecutes, and imprisons Black people disproportionately. It's a system which also attempts to excuse and explain away the deaths of Blacks at the hands of the police. So go back to that list that I read at the beginning of the talk. What were some of the explanations you might have heard justifying or excusing their deaths? They were in the wrong place. They were up to no good. They were threatening the police. If they had complied, they wouldn't have been hurt. What are those? Those are social mores. Those are social explanations justifying why the law or lack of law was applied in the way that it was. They were explaining away why someone died at the hands of the police. All right, so it should be clear that structural racism, by defining race, shapes the identities of Blacks, Latinos, Asians, and other minorities in the United States. But key to Father Massengale's definition is structural racism also forms the identity of the dominant group. It forms the identity of white people. We're part of a social network, a social construct that tells us what the place of white people is by virtue of being white. And also, it shapes the stories that are told by the dominant culture, the stories that we tell one another about who we are as a nation, what we believe in, okay? These are shaped by the dominant group, and they're shaped by, among other things, not totally, but certainly by the racism which pervades society, the structural racism, the fears, the structures of racial identity and the significance that we give to them. If that shapes the experience of Blacks and Latinos, it must also shape the experience of whites. And so let's talk about the stories we tell one another. And in the South, that means talking about statues, flags, and the lost cause. More precisely, it means talking about Confederate memorial statues, the Confederate flag, and the lost cause ideology. So what is that? Well, I want to return again to Bishop Braxton, and this is how he defined it. For some Southerners, these statues are a reminder of the commitment of some to the lost cause, a defense of the Civil War as an honorable struggle for the Southern way of life and denial of the central role human slavery played in the war. The lost cause was the old order of the Confederacy, of which racial superiority, sustained by Jim Crow laws, and an apartheid-like form of absolute racial segregation were an integral part. So in other words, the lost cause ideology was an interconnected series of stories that people both North and South, especially in the South, but these same stories are told in the North, which explained away the Civil War, which explained away the racism that led to slavery, and that was used to uphold the Jim Crow order. Well, Jim Crow is gone, but is the lost cause gone? Think about it. If we had repudiated the lost cause, would we still be so attached to statues honoring the Confederacy? Would the Confederate flag still have such a prominent place in American life today? Why was it only within the past few years that the Confederate flag was taken down at the Alabama state capitol? Why was it that it took multiple ballot initiatives to remove the Confederate flag from the state flag of Mississippi? Why did the state of Alabama pass a law making it illegal to take down Confederate memorials? Defending history is the explanation. Whose history? What stories are being defended? And what is the import of the Confederate flag? And I think this picture taken last week summarizes the role it plays today in American society. This was taken January 6th during the mob assault on the Capitol building. The FBI has identified the individual as Kevin Seafried. Mr. Seafried accomplished what General Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia couldn't do. He raised the Confederate flag in the Capitol of the United States. And this wasn't a one-off. There were multiple Confederate flags being flown at that demonstration. There were multiple t-shirts and signs with racist slogans on them. Somehow, this was integral to the identity of all the people involved, integral to a broad slice of American life. And at this moment, understandably, I'm sure your discomfort in talking about race and in talking about racism is reaching a peak. And I know a lot of you are thinking the following. You're thinking to yourselves, but that is not who we are. We've all heard this in the past week. I have heard this for years whenever the subject of race and racism in America comes up. And here's what I must tell you. I agree. In some sense, this is not who you are. You are not a Confederate flag waving racist ideologue. You don't hold to the racist ideology of the past. But here's the question that I have to ask. How comfortable are you living in a society where this is commonplace, or at least a commonplace horror? I have three questions touching right here on our own hometown of Tuscaloosa. And I call Tuscaloosa my adopted home now. So, three questions. Why are Blacks, who are 27% of Alabama's population, only 11% of the student body at the University of Alabama, flagship institution of our state, our pride and joy academically, why are Blacks so underrepresented in the student body? At a lower level of the high schools in town, why is Central High School overwhelmingly Black? But Northridge High School across the river is majority white. Or just down the road, I live in a development on Hargrove called the Downs. Why did the first Black person move into the Downs only in 2020? Why were my Black colleagues at the University of Alabama surprised that a white real estate agent would show me, a Mexican American, a house in the Downs. I don't know. Is this who we are? I'd like to believe this is not who we are, but somehow, and let's go back to what the American bishops said, somehow we've become unwitting accomplices in racism in America. Okay, we might not be actively accomplices, but we are complicit because it exists and we accept it as just the way things are. Or for each of these examples, you might be trying to explain each one away. So let's go back to the goals in the Martin de Porres project. As I said, the first goal of this project is helping our fellow Catholics see racism in America. And I hope through this talk, I've helped you to do that. It's going to be uncomfortable. Nobody wants to see it. I didn't want to see it. You don't want to see it, but that doesn't mean it's not there. Once we see it, once we accept it for the injustice that it is, we are called by our faith, by our church, to build racial justice in America. How are we going to do that? And lastly, the goal of building racial justice is peace, to bring healing to America, to bring healing to our church through racial harmony. We all want to jump to the last step. But remember, the resurrection had to be preceded by the cross. We cannot reach racial harmony without admitting to and seeing and combating the racism which exists in American society. You and I may not be personally racist, but as the American bishop said, we have become accomplices in racism. And so I want to finish my talk with a homework assignment, which I call the challenge of listening. And here's how the American bishops put it in their pastoral, Open Wide Our Hearts. As Christians, we are called to listen and know the stories of our brothers and sisters. We must create opportunities to hear with open hearts the tragic stories that are deeply imprinted on the lives of our brothers and sisters, if we are to be moved with empathy to promote justice. This is hard because it requires us to do two things. And I include myself in this. I'm Latino. My experience is neither white nor black in America. But I need to listen to my black brothers and sisters. You, most of you are white, I assume, in my audience, you need to listen to the stories of our black brothers and sisters. You need to listen to the stories of Latinos and Asians in America. Stories that are not yours, that are different from your experience, that will show you a different side of America. You need to listen to these stories and accept what our brothers and sisters are telling you, not trying to dismiss them and not trying to explain it away. Accept it and build upon it. And so now I want to close with a reading from the prophet Ezekiel. This was God's call to the people of Israel who had abandoned him. And in a lot of ways, we as a people, as a church, as a nation, have abandoned the call that God has given us, our baptismal call. This is God calling to us. For I will take you out of the nations. I will gather you from all the countries and bring you back into your own land. I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean. I will cleanse you from all your impurities and from all your idols. I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. Then you will live in the land I gave your ancestors. You will be my people, and I will be your God. Amen. Thank you all very much. And again, my apologies for making this a recorded talk, one of the hazards of the pandemic. But if I was there and present, I would love to talk with people about this, answer your questions, engage in some open discussion about this. Look for me on social media. I have a Facebook presence, or you can write to me directly. Here's my email address, david.cruz-uribe1963@gmail.com. Thank you all for your attention. God bless and have a great day.